This past weekend, I was playing in my first over the board chess tournament, the 2026 Kansas Open in Wichita, Kansas. And this video will be the game analysis of my round two matchup. So I had just come off a 3-hour marathon game in round one where I was able to get the win. And then pretty shortly after that ended, ate lunch and then came back for this second game. And here I get the white pieces, and I'll be facing my opponent. Apologize if I mispronounce the name, Sreyansh Tadepalli. He was a young Indian kid. Maybe he was upper middle school, or he could have been maybe like a freshman or sophomore in high school. But he was pretty young, and he's rated 942 prior to the start of the tournament. So, as white, I always open, or generally speaking, always open with e4, and so that's the opening that I play. And he responded with e5. So in this setup, there's typically two things that I will play when I'm playing online. I'll either play f4 to enter a king's gambit, or I will play knight f3 to try and get into a Scotch game is usually my preferred opening to get into with this move. And since I was playing over the board, King's Gambit is great in shorter time controls online, like Blitz or something like that. But with a long classical game, we each have 100 minutes on our clock. I did not want to enter into anything too dubious or too precarious. I just wanted to keep it solid and kind of play principled chess. I didn't want to take any risks just yet. And so I played knight f3, and then he responded, this is attacking the pawn. He responded with knight c6, which is great. And then I play d4, and this is the Scotch game opening, or the Scottish opening. And so the idea here being you have two attackers of this black pawn. Typically what will happen next is black will decide to exchange pawns in the center. So they'll take like this, and then you take with the knight, and then they take with the knight, and then you recapture with the queen, and material is equal, and white has a pawn sitting here in the center with their queen in the center, and an easy way to develop and castle. That's usually what happens online. He does take, and then I recapture with the knight. However, here, normally black will come in with the knight, and the knights get traded off. He responds with bishop c5. So I have played against this online, but it's certainly not what I was expecting. I think it's a much less common variation of the opening at this general skill level, for amateur and lower intermediate players. So I wasn't totally expecting that. I decided to go ahead and take his knight. My thought process is he'll be doubling his pawns, so that is slightly better for me, I think. And so we arrive at this position, which so far these are all book moves apparently. Not that I would have known that during the game, but looking back in game review, apparently this is an opening that has been played by thousands or millions of other people reaching this position. So far, we haven't really started to play chess yet. We're just getting through our opening moves. At this point, I have a few different decisions to make about how I'm going to progress. But what I like is bishop c4. So this does a couple things for me. First of all, it's opening up my back rank so that I can castle. That's one reason I like this move. The other one is it is targeting the weak f7 square. And so if I were ever to bring my queen here or here, we'd be threatening checkmate. And so to me, this felt like the best way to go. He responds with knight f6, and so this is kind of shutting down what I was just talking about. If my queen comes here, the knight can take it. If my queen comes here, it's blocking the path. So he's kind of preventing any checkmating ideas on this square, and then also, he might be able to castle in the near future. And so here, I wasn't exactly sure what to do next. Up to this point, I had been pausing and thinking about every move. Even though we were in the opening and I was somewhat familiar with it, I had been taking like 1, 2, 3 minutes per move. So I'd already used like 10 to 15 minutes of my clock to get to this point, and he was playing very fast. He was taking anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds per move. So I'd sit and think for a few minutes, and then I'd make a move. He'd write it down, and then pretty much instantly he would make his next move. So I could see that he was playing very fast, and I think that'll kind of help explain some of what happens later in the game. So, I could have pushed the pawn and sort of tried to kick his knight somewhere else, but what I actually decided to do is play bishop g5. And the reason I decided to do this is because now we're pinning the knight to the queen. So if this knight ever moves, he loses a queen. And so to me, this was like, he's attacking this pawn, but if he decides to take it, right, he loses the queen. And so that was kind of a good way, in my mind, to tactically defend this pawn I have sitting in the middle of the board. He pushes the h6 pawn, trying to kick my bishop out. But again, if I move my bishop back somewhere, I'm going to lose this pawn. So I actually just rock the bishop back to h4, and so we're maintaining this pin along the diagonal here. He still can't move his knight, and if he decides to kick me out again, that's really bad for him, because now his king side would just be Swiss cheese, right? And so you really probably don't want to bring the pawn up here to g5, which he does not do. He decides to defend by going back with his bishop. So that's breaking the pin. I will no longer be able to freeze his knight on this square. So at this point, I play e5 because the knight was threatening to jump in on the pawn. Didn't want that to happen, so we go ahead and push the pawn forward to safety a little bit. And then he plays a move that I was not expecting, which was knight d5. So here, I wasn't entirely sure what to do. I do have two pieces attacking here, so if I take and then he takes, I can recapture this way, but he also has two pieces pointed at my bishop. So there was some calculation that needed to happen here for me to decide what the best course of action was. And apparently, according to the engine, I do not take the correct course of action, but it does, it kind of works out in the game. Nothing too terrible happens. So I go ahead and decide to take the knight because I don't like his knight being in the middle of the board. So bishop takes, and then rather than recapturing right away with his pawn, he plays bishop takes h4. So we are equal in terms of material, although he has the bishop pair. And so at this point, my bishop is hanging, and so I have to decide what I am going to do with it. In my mind, I kind of had some crazy ideas of like sacking the bishop, and then his king would come out, and then I could, bring the queen out and give some checks. The problem is, since these are connected, because if this queen wasn't protecting the bishop, I could sack the bishop, bring him out, give a check, and then pick up the bishop. But since these are defended, right, that doesn't do anything for me. And again, I'm like, I really don't want to be taking any serious risks. So yeah, he's threatening to take my bishop rather than moving my bishop. What I end up deciding to do is just attack his bishop. And again, the computer does not like this decision, but in the moment, that's what I decided was my best bet. So I played g3, attacking his bishop. He takes my bishop. I take his bishop back. And then I was kind of expecting him to recapture with the queen, and then I would take this pawn, and we'd still be equal in material. However, that is not what happens. What he does next is bishop b7. And I think already this I'm starting to get the sense of what type of player he is, which is he's a very cunning, clever, tricky player. And so again, he's been playing very fast this whole time. And throughout the analysis, we'll see some instances of him coming up with these really clever resources. And this is kind of the first inkling of that, right? Because he's lining up the bishop on the same diagonal as my rook. And so if he pushes this pawn, like let's say I decide to develop my knight, and then he pushes this pawn, well, now all of a sudden the knight's hanging to the pawn and the rook is hanging to the bishop. So fortunately, that didn't happen. But right, that's the kind of setup that he's looking for, and that's the kind of stuff that I'm going to have to be careful of all game long. So what I decide to do next, don't know if this was the best move or not, but in my mind, I thought it was a good move. I decide to play Queen G4. My thought process is I am defending this pawn that is under attack from his queen, and then I'm also attacking his G pawn. And so he's going to have to move his rook, or he's going to have to castle, or he's going to have to do something, because otherwise I'll pick up a free pawn and then be targeting his rook in the corner. So next, he plays G6 to deal with that threat. So now, still defending the pawn. If I take this, now it's defended, so that doesn't work. I wonder if castling might have been better, but this is what he decides to do. And then I play knight d2 because I want to be able to castle queenside and develop my knight. But again, as previously stated, I can't develop it to the natural square on knight c3 because of that tactic with the pawn and the bishop. So I'm like, okay, this is the only square it can go to so that I can castle, and then I can get it back into the game, one of these other ways down the road. He plays Queen e7, which I suppose is targeting my pawn in the center here, and then also, allowing it to clear out his back rank so that he can castle either direction. And so I actually just decide to castle. And my thought process here is, even though this pawn is hanging, he can take this pawn. If he decides to do that, I can slide my rook over, and then his queen would be pinned, and I would be able to win his queen. And then if he takes, right, my rook comes in. So I intentionally left this pawn hanging because I was thinking maybe he'd take, and then I could get the pin. That didn't happen. He plays d4. So now he's testing, he's prodding to see if I will notice that my rook is hanging, which I did. And so I move it to rook hg1. I could have moved it to anywhere on this back rank. I didn't want to move it to the e file because that blocks this rook into place. And in case later on I didn't want this rook being trapped if his bishop got in. I didn't want to move it to the f file because, again, it's on a light square, and so this bishop could potentially target it. So my thought process was, if I put it on the g file, it is never going to be targeted by this bishop, and then maybe later on, it would control this open file since I have doubled pawns over on the side here. So then at that point, he also castles. So we castled on the same side as each other, which is kind of interesting. We both ended up castling queenside. And then I play queen takes d4 because this pawn was hanging, and I thought, okay, I can win a pawn and I'll be up 1 point of material. Computer doesn't like it, but in my mind, I'm now up a pawn, which may not seem like a big deal, but I think in an over-the-board classical game, a 1 or 2 pawn advantage is enough to trade down into an endgame and potentially be okay just with that. Furthermore, also, I'm targeting this. So if he doesn't defend that, or if he doesn't push it, I'll pick up a second pawn down the road. He does decide to defend the pawn by sliding his king over, so that's no longer an option. And then next, I play rook g4, which felt, it felt kind of weird playing this, I will say. I don't exactly remember what the thought process was. Maybe I was planning to, come here, and then this bishop's pinned, and if he wants to trade, then my rook comes over and I can kind of get my rooks out and about. Maybe that was the thought process. I don't remember exactly what my purpose was with this. And one of the things, actually, after I played this, as it was his turn, I was thinking in my head, oh crap, I was thinking about this pin with the bishop, um, and it didn't even occur to me that my knight would be defending that. So I kind of panicked a little, and I was like, oh, I hope he doesn't play, bishop f3, and then I didn't even realize that that wasn't a threat. So yeah, again, I'm not entirely sure what I was doing with the rook here. Maybe I wanted to move my queen, but I wanted to somehow protect this pawn. I don't know, but somehow my rook ended up on this square. He plays d6, and at this point, there's some decisions to be made. Do we capture with the pawn? Do we push? Do we ignore? What do we do here? And again, he had been playing very quickly, so my thought process was, maybe if I take here, if he takes with his queen, we can trade the queens, and that's fine. And if he takes with his rook, that would hang the rook in the corner. So I was like, all right, maybe we capture. And again, he was playing very quickly, and I was playing very slowly. And I think after the first couple moves, when he saw that I was playing very slowly, he became a little impatient. And so anytime he'd make a move, and then I'd sit there for longer than 30 to 60 seconds, he would get up and start walking around, looking at other games, going to get water, stretching his legs. He never stayed at the board after his move because he knew I was going to be sitting there thinking, and I guess he didn't want to be sitting at the board waiting for me. So again, he was playing very fast. At this point, maybe I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes have come off my clock, and he's probably used, I don't know, 10 minutes at most. He's barely used any time on his clock. So I decide to take. He takes d6, and then here he really needs to recapture with the queen or the pawn, which, you don't want to recapture with the pawn because then A, it's an isolated pawn, and B, you're removing some of the protection for your king. And if you take with the queen, we're going to trade the queens, and he probably doesn't want that either. But again, he's playing very quickly, so he didn't spend a lot of time calculating, and he takes with the rook, which then hangs the rook in the corner. So he made this move and then got up and walked off. And I saw immediately that this rook was hanging. I didn't want to make the move while he was away from the board. I guess I could have, but I was waiting. So eventually, when he came back and sat down, I played queen takes h8 check. And at this point, I'm up 6 points of material. He just hung a rook, and so I'm like, okay, this should be a winning position that I can convert. He blocks with rook d8, and then I take queen takes h6, taking another pawn, getting my queen to safety, and now we're up 7 points of material. So this is a very good position to be in. I got a win in my first game, and now I'm in a clearly superior position in my second game. All I have to do is stay focused and be disciplined and convert. Simplify and convert. And even though I've been taking a lot of time compared to him, I still have at least 50, 55 minutes left on my clock. Should be plenty of time to get to the end of this. And so then he plays queen d7, which does two things. One, he's targeting my rook, so I'm going to have to reposition it or defend it somehow. Two, he's lining up this battery so that if I ever move this knight, he's got checkmating ideas, basically. So I have to be a little careful in how I play this. And again, he's a very sharp player, and so I know I kind of have to be careful here. I play queen g5. My thought process is I'm defending the rook and still maintaining, defense of this square, and it kind of gives me room to move around. If he ever moves his queen, right, I could take the rook. And so I thought that this was a good square to be on. I didn't think there was anything wrong with this. And then he plays bishop f3, which looks like a pretty good move, actually. This is the fork that I was worried about earlier because he's attacking both rooks simultaneously. And earlier in the game, we came to the conclusion that I can just snap it up with the knight. But here, and again, if we were playing online blitz, maybe I would have done that. But luckily, we were playing classical, and I was able to pause and think about things. So what happens if I take with the bishop? Well, what happens is I'm going to get checkmated. So luckily, that's not what I do. Rather, I'm not going to get checkmated, and I'm still not going to lose the rook, or at least not in this scenario. So what I play next is rook b4 check. And so I get this rook to safety. His king is in check. He's going to have to either bring the bishop back to block, he'll have to move over to the corner, or he'll have to move over to c8. And what he ends up doing is moving to king c8. This is actually a mistake. He should have gone the other direction, because now I have the ability to threaten checkmate. So I move over to queen b5, and if I get my queen here, that is checkmate. So at this point, he can't block with the bishop anymore, and there's nowhere to go for his king. His only move to continue the game and not get checkmated on the next move, he has no choice but to trade the queens off. So that's what he does. And as soon as we trade the queens, really his counterattacking chances have diminished quite a bit. So he still goes ahead and he does win the rook with his bishop. But at the end of the day here, I'm up 5 points of material with no queens. So this is a pretty manageable situation for me. Now, granted, it still takes a while to convert. He defends very well, but there's really just not much he can do to fight back in this situation. So he attacks my rook. I move it to safety, trying to get it in onto the 7th rank. He prevents that by bringing his king forward. Now I come back over to target this pawn. There's nothing he can do to defend it except move the rook, but now his only good piece is going to be stuck here defending this pawn. I push a pawn forward because I'm not really sure what to do. He brings the king over, getting ready to defend the pawn. I push my pawn. He takes, I take. Great, we're simplifying. He brings his king back over. I push my other pawn. I have a lovely pawn chain here. He brings the rook over to defend his f-pawn. I bring my knight into the center of the board. He attacks my knight. I can't take because it's defended, so I give a check. After he moves out a check, I move my knight back to safety, and then he gives a check, move my king into the middle, and he can't come in because this is guarded, this is guarded, this is guarded. This square does nothing for him, so there's really nowhere for him to go with the rook here. He is able to save that pawn temporarily, but I just bring my rook over, looking to capture it in a future turn. He pushes his pawn. I freeze his pawn. He brings his rook over, targeting my h-pawn, and there's really nothing I can do to defend it at this point, so I just go ahead and capture his a-pawn. He captures my h-pawn with check. I have to move into the center. And then he is targeting this, and I can't move here because of the pawn, but I could move up to e4, which is what I do. Now my king is kind of planted in the center of the board. He can't take, he can't target me because of his own piece. His king is now blocked off from these squares, and so he's really running out of options at this point. So he brings the rook up anyway. I bring the knight back, getting ready to capture this pawn. He moves the king over. I take the pawn. He pushes his other pawn forward. I give a check, and this is cutting off his king. This is going to allow me to come in and eat this pawn here in a little bit. He threatens my rook. I slide it over. He brings the rook down. I move my king in to get this pawn. He's targeting this weak, undefended pawn here. That's fine. We trade pawns. And so at this point, I have 3 pawns remaining, a knight and a rook, and all he has is a rook. So really, I just have to find a way to get one of these guys to the promotion square. That's my goal at this point, is like somehow, shepherd one of them to the other end of the board. So I bring my knight in, which is now defending this pawn, and also giving me the ability to guard some of these key squares around here. He moves his king into the corner, which I'm not really sure about because this allows me to cut it off on the 7th rank. So his king is stuck back here forever. He plays rook takes a3, so he does win one more pawn, but I should be able to defend these two. I mean, this is defended by the king, this is defended by the rook, so I don't see how he's going to win either of those. And I play knight b6 check. Okay, so then after knight b6 check, he moves to king b8. I think that might have been, yeah, it was his only legal move. And so then I actually, well, yeah, I bring my king up to king c6. And then at this point, things are looking pretty good for me. He does go ahead and take on f3, which is leaving his rook hanging. And actually what was happening during the game is I thought that this was a stalemate trap. I thought that if I took his rook, that I'd stalemate the king. And that's actually not the case, because if I take the rook, his king can move to a7. For whatever reason, during the game, I thought this would be stalemate, so I didn't take the rook. I actually moved my knight to d7 to give a check. And the other reason this is terrible is because I missed a forced mate. I missed mate in 1. I should have moved rook b7 checkmate, and so this would have ended the game right there. But I didn't see that during the game. I kind of got spooked thinking he was going for some kind of stalemate trap, and so I totally missed that. So you know what they say, when you have mate in 1, look for something better. And apparently what I thought was better, which was not actually better, was knight d7 check. He moves to king a8. Now I take the rook, because apparently from this position I realized he could move to a7, but in this position I thought it was a stalemate. I don't know why. So I take his rook, he moves to king a7, and yet again I have a checkmate available. That is mate. But in my mind I'm like, okay, I need to cut him off. Keep him on the 7th rank. He was already, keep him on the A file. He was already on the A file. But my mind was just so fried from playing several hours of chess that like I was not seeing the board clearly. And so then he moves up. I move my king up, trying to force him back to A7 to deliver that kind of classic king and rook checkmate, even though I already had the mate available. He moves back, and then I finally deliver the mate after missing, 2 or 3. And the very first thing he said to me after the game, we kind of shook hands and said good game, and then he was like, oh, you had mate like here and here and here, and I was like, oh, like I didn't even see those. I'm so sorry. Like he probably thought I was messing with him or having like bad manners, and it's like I wasn't trying to mess with you. Like I didn't see that. So that was kind of embarrassing that I missed a couple of those forced mates. But nonetheless, we did get the win. So he was also a really good, polite opponent, really cool kid. You can tell he's very good at chess, and I think if he slows down a little bit and doesn't play so quickly, he'd probably be a very, very formidable opponent. So that was my game 2. I'm 2-0 after my first 2 OTB games. And so then later that evening, I had game 3, was scheduled for 7 p.m. This one did get done a little bit earlier. I had used well over half my clock. Maybe I had, 30 or so minutes left, but he really had not used much of his at all. I mean, he had maybe used like 30 or 40 minutes max, and most of that came after he hung the rook. So yeah, definitely he was just playing a little bit too quickly. But yeah, we managed to pick up the win. So in the next video, we'll go over game 3. Thanks.